All right. Oh, good morning. Dr. R. Michael Fisher here, and I'm with Melissa Soenke from University of California. She's a researcher, psychologist, interested in the topic probably we're going to flow around today is terror management theory and what I like to call terror management therapy. And we'll see where that goes. How's that sound, Melissa?
Sounds good.
Yeah, great. So you're in California right now?
Yeah, I'm at California State University, Channel Islands.
Okay. And what kind of courses do you teach down there?
So I'm a social psychologist. So I teach social psychology, theories of personality, human motivation, and I teach some topics courses on stress and coping and all kinds of things related to probably what we'll be talking about today.
Okay, yeah, good. No, none of us are stressed. Coping, no
Right.
problem. In the world of polarizations and then the world of conflict, why did R. Michael Fisher start this dialogue series? So I just want to introduce before we get going, Melissa, that this dialogue idea really is a design for communication, obviously, is kind of the focus, because I do see a world that is very, probably not very well educated on how to do conflict and difference and differences. And yes, there's all kinds of approaches and techniques, but I think the idea of dialogue is so fundamental to the way that we all part of creation. I'm part of creation, you're part of creation, and creation's just trying to talk to each other in all its differences. So I'm kind of trying to put us on the same teeter-totter. I don't know if you were around when we had teeter-totters in parks or any of the viewers listening today. I used to love those because, one was on one end, one on the other. And of course, what one did on the other one end affected what you could do on the other end. And so you decided at some point to enter the game of a dialogue with our bodies in play space. And I just always thought that was so interesting, yet we're on such different polar ends. So I thought an interesting metaphor. So this idea of the dialogue series was really for that kind of communication to allow us to be able to say what we need to say. And then, whether you agree or disagree, we're still willing to play the game of going up and down and playing. See, whether we agree or disagree, it doesn't matter because we're still willing to just do that. And I think that's the very foundation of what social relation is. Very
Definitely.
foundation of sociality, right? The
Mhm.
whole aspect of how we grow and develop as social beings. But then I added this idea of I really wanted to do this dialogue with the topic of fear. And so that's why I call it Fear Talks. And I'm absolutely intrigued that you weren't afraid enough to come in and you just said, I'll do this. And I went, okay, because I don't know Melissa. And most of the guests I know a little bit more, but her and I have no connection other than through a little bit of reading that we've probably done on each other. Melissa, why on earth would you come in to do this dialogue?
Yeah, I think I really appreciate the focus and goal that you just mentioned, this idea of like intellectual conversation on these topics that I think are so important to everyone right now. I think especially now. I've found that in, teaching the topics I teach on terror management, my students relate to it in a way that they never have before because of the kind of environment that we've been living in through COVID and with this political polarization that you mentioned. And so, yeah, when I'm given the opportunity to kind of learn from you and also to talk a little bit about my knowledge on the topic, just sounded really fun. And I know also getting to see your engagement with people that I know well, like Sheldon, made me really excited for this opportunity.
Well, that's great. I'm glad you're so alive and still excited and having fun in academia.
Yeah, right.
As an
Yeah, we have to find our I think our enjoyment in it, and we're all attracted to it for a reason, and it's about continuing to remind ourselves of those reasons.
Yeah, and it's so interesting, we're putting the word together fun, with the idea of terror management. Oh yeah, right.
Yeah.
And then you look at someone like Sheldon Solomon, who's one of the founders of terror management theory and a researcher, and as you know, a colleague of yours and so on. Um, it's just so obvious how much he uses humor every second of his speaking when he's speaking about such a terrifying topic as terror, and yet he also realizes that I guess that's not what we should be. Like in some way he's demonstrating, I think, in using the Ernest Becker philosophy behind terror management theory, he's really demonstrating Yeah, well, that's how it may feel. Like it may feel like existence is a pretty nasty place. We've got this problem of mortality going to hit us. We have no control over it at some level. We're all going to die, as he says. But then the aspect of, the therapeutic part of coming to understand terror, coming to understand fear, and a relationship with them both is how to have that in a way that we don't feel victims in life. So that's
Mhm.
my quick take. How do you relate to that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Doing research on this topic is also interesting because I think you engage with it in a different, like more intellectual, less
Yeah.
emotional way that I think is very interesting. Um, yeah, so
What do you mean by interesting? Does it allow you to go deeper? Does it allow you to see things more? How so? Then
yeah.
you're talking about more the objective researcher. Your topic is terror management and how people manage terror. We'll just call it fear if you want.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting position to be in because we both are interested in understanding kind of the process and how we manage these concerns. But I think ultimately, also, many of us have to have our own systems to manage it. I'm not sure that maybe this is the case for some people, but for me, terror management theory is not the system that helps me to kind of cope with the fear, but it does help me to appreciate when I see things happening out in the world. And I think, again, like our political polarization right now is such a great example. Our kind of inability to have civil conversations, I think, as a result of all of this mortality, we call it mortality salience, right? That death is just in the forefront and we're so aware of it all the time. And I think that yeah, kind of engaging in those two levels is a really, I say, interesting thing, right? I don't know how else to describe it, but that you have this duality. You have the researcher and the more intellectual aspect, and you observe yourself engaging in processes as well, I think. I don't know if that makes sense, but
I mean, it's the advantage, I think, of not just having techniques, which
mm,
we can learn. So, if any one of our viewers or anyone said, well, how can I manage terror better? Or we'll just call it fear.
yeah,
Terror being to me an extreme of fear on a scale. Is that okay? Yeah, we can
yeah,
agree
definitely.
on that. Okay. So I'll call it fear management from now
Yeah,
on for just a moment. And the idea really, I guess, was that if you take a technique approach,
mm,
I'm looking for a method. I'm looking for a technique to cope with, to manage, to cushion, to assuage that sort of negative feeling that often goes with fear. Um, then I'm just looking for more techniques.
yeah,
Now, I think what you're speaking to is, but what about if you brought theory to that
yeah.
practice of techniques?
I think that's a good way of describing it. And I'm very interested in, I'd love to also hear about your ideas about techniques, because I think we do a lot of explaining without always knowing how to resolve the problem, right? We identify the problem and we talk about ways that people manage it. And often, although there's an area of research thinking about how terror management processes can kind of increase pro-social and positive behaviors, a lot of it has been focused around more defensive responses. And I'm very interested in what you're implying. And I think what a lot of people are very interested in right now is where is the maybe distinction between like these defensive processes versus something that is maybe more acceptance and more of like you're talking about techniques that we might cultivate for managing that.
Mm. Yeah, so just for people who may not be up on terror management theory, let's just give a quick little scan for them is you can look that up on the internet. There's tons of material on terror management theory. There's also a very good video I highly recommend as an intro, Flight
Mhm.
from Death.
I have my students watch it. They really enjoy it.
Yeah, I think it's just so popularly and nicely done. It's a marvelous piece of art, actually, I
Yeah.
think, and very emotional. It's back in 2005. That will give you a good idea of what we're talking about today, which is in flight from death, in flight or in fear of death, which is the kind of common greatest fear, so called, of humans. Um, how do we react and respond to that, both consciously and then what we're unaware of, responding and reacting to fear of death and reminders of death. So that will come up in terror management theory. We're not here today, Melissa, as far as I'm concerned, to try to discuss. There's a lot of videos on terror management theory, and I know.
I'm happy to offer any explanation, but I'm like you, if we're good to
Yeah,
focus in a different direction, that sounds
I
great.
think that the chance here we have is as somebody who's been involved in terror management research yourself professionally and as an academic, to actually be able to talk in between the spaces of academia,
Sure.
right? To talk at that more personal level, and then explore with people like myself and how I've approached it.
Yeah.
So here's another way. We're talking about techniques, but we're also talking about a philosophy. So a book called The Beauty of Fear, 2005, and the subtitle, How to Positively Enjoy Being Afraid. Subtitle. Samuel Gillian, I've been researching him for a few years. This book, not well known at all. It was self-published back in 2005. He was a member of the Ernest Becker Foundation for years. He had read Becker. He had hung around the foundation, the community. He died in 2016, passed away, and left 2 books for us on really his application as an educator to how to actually implement understanding how to positively be afraid. And the reason he was basically saying is that we need to learn that foundation by first. So there's techniques, but he said, but first, you have to understand reality.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was a really interesting notion, right? It's like, okay, so where do we in school, help kids understand reality? And it starts with this principle that Ernest Becker started. And I really want to see what you might want to say about the notion of repression,
Mm-hmm.
where we, in a sense, perceptively deceive ourselves
Mm-hmm.
because of a particular set of conditions that Gillian, Becker, Otto Rank, and others talked about, because death is scary as hell for a living organism, in blunt words. So this problem of repression seems to me like any techniques, right, that we want to use in fear management. If you're not dealing with a notion of how is repression affected to the notion of our understanding of reality.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't get to that level, then we're just playing with techniques up here.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts you have about that? What do you understand, first of all, from your point of view as a terror management theory researcher, but also your personal life, even?
Yeah. I think when I think about that piece, immediately when you start to talk about reality and this idea of, I think along with repression is all of the different ways that we, I don't know how to explain it, like create or manipulate our reality in a way to kind of distance ourselves from the reality of death. Yeah, I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about this kind of idea and again, what it means maybe on an individual level to be accepting that reality or not. And so, yeah, I don't know if that's helpful, but my sense is that that repression is, part of that. I think I would think about it less in terms of like concrete, like just focus on repression itself and more about like all of the different ways that we kind of construct our reality around, maybe it is right, moving away from that idea.
I guess a simple other way is language people might relate to as well. It's defense mechanisms that
Yes, yes.
which are many, right? I don't know how many there is.
I can think of, yeah, off the top of my head a few, but I think that that's part of what I'm thinking about, and from the theory perspective, kind of when death is in conscious awareness, some of those more proximal defenses that we use that are, I'm thinking a lot about justification, ways that we distance ourselves from death by saying, I'm young, it's not going to affect me. And so at that level, maybe also just like the techniques we use to distract. But then I think we can go deeper into those distal defenses that really are about changing the reality and talking about even, types of immortality that we talk about within terror management theory that create a different kind of reality for us surrounding death. Is that kind of
Mhm.
in line with what you're thinking?
Yeah, I think so. Do you have any questions for me just off the top as you were thinking of coming to this conversation?
Yeah, I guess my big question is about this acceptance. What do you think are the key processes that people undergo or that kind of increase their maybe likelihood of being maybe more accepting as opposed to defensive in terms of their responses?
So let's talk about accepting. Specifically are you thinking about accepting the reality of the kind of the horror, terrific horror of life?
Yeah, and I'm wondering maybe you have a different take too. I'm thinking now when we think about this idea of like kind of living positively with the fear, that maybe that's something different than acceptance. And maybe we can unpack some of those differences, that maybe there are a lot of different responses. And, again, terror management might focus on defensive. I'm thinking today we're focusing on kind of these others,
Mhm.
but is there something different between accepting the reality of that terror and, I don't know, in some way coming to terms with it, or this idea of still having that fear, but having maybe this more positive relationship to it?
Mhm. Well, just to start with educationally, right? And we know that all psychology, psychotherapy has a huge educational component. Same with terror management theory. And I do think terror management theory is a cultural therapy.
Mm,
I've thrown that out to Sheldon. I said, it's a cultural therapia. And by I meant that it's got an ontological philosophical aspect to the therapy. It's not just psychological, individualized, emotional, in that kind of way. And
mhm,
he loved it. He said, yeah, yeah, yeah. He says it is a therapy. It's at a different level than what we understand as normal therapy. Well, what's that got to do? It's got to do with really this philosophical inquiry at some level. And Gillian in this book, as I've been reading it, he was very philosophical. And so he spends a lot of time thinking about reality and how we, come to reality. But in the end, he does basically sort of say our first problem we have to start is kind of like the alcoholic that and AA has come up with a pretty good set of techniques, and patterns, right, that are quite effective with very difficult behaviors in addictions. So in a way, if I started and he starts, and I think Becker is saying the same thing, you can challenge me on this. He is saying we're addicted to not being in touch with reality as a modern Western culture.
mhm,
So I'm not going to try to speak about other nations and cultures and indigenous peoples and so on. And that's probably thousands of years old.
mhm,
There's several people have tracked this archaeologically and other kinds of ways and made arguments. Perhaps even as far back to when we went into full-scale agriculture as a
mhm,
species, we started to disengage from nature.
mhm,
So now we've brought in the word nature. And so I would actually say, just to go back to the technique, because there's some level people go, well, yeah, but what's the technique? I always get this all the time because I want to be philosophical. Okay, okay. Well, the first technique is nature. That's an interesting thought. That nature itself, herself, however we want to refer to her. In AA, they refer to it as a higher power.
mhm,
Step one. So this is again, we're unwinding the addiction process, right? Which the addiction process is being one of a set of defensive systems through practicing repetitive self-medicating processes or
mhm,
avoidant processes from pain equals life and suffering. and that you will die, and so on. All these things were out of control of their, geez, that's a bad deal. That's a bum deal. I thought life was, so we're living those, taught fantasies and taught and imagined possibilities of a good life.
Mhm.
So once we have to come to a relationship, that's really the first technique. As far as, I mean, if you asked me another day, I'd probably start in a whole different direction on this question. But today I'm just going to, oh yeah, well, it's nature. And then,
Mhm.
well, that's the higher power. Nature represents the supreme, the all powerful, the absolute everything. There's nothing that is not God, for example, if you're to use that. Everything is God. That's the beauty of that term. And that gives it that more immortality protection.
Mhm.
Well, what is that protection? It's, well, at least I can relate to that seems absolutely all powerful. Why? Because I don't feel very empowered, and I don't feel empowered in a tiny little speck of flesh.
Mhm.
Sheldon goes into
Yes.
other comments about the flesh, and that is dissipating, it is dying, and that feels really awful and sad, and it's scary as hell for at some level. So I think this idea of interventions, and it does not surprise me that we, in this highly polarized world that we're in, right, that really we are tearing the very fabric of our sociality. We're tearing the fabric of our ecological relationships apart. We are ripping it apart. Well,
Mhm.
talk about a reevaluation.
Mhm.
And that's what an addict has to do.
Mhm.
You have to rip your life apart. And it says, here's 12 steps of how to do that. So, whether you follow that tradition or not, I think I am not at all surprised, therefore, in a cultural level, a historical cultural level, especially of the traumatic and the recovery, right, of decolonizing and coming to a relationship to understand what we have done to Indigenous peoples around the world and what they have done before we came along, even to get basic knowledge on that, right? That's a whole education. That,
Right.
does it surprise me that we're turning to people who actually are in touch with nature, reality, and lived in a state of relative, sane, healthy, sustainable lifestyle for 99% of our human species evolution? Why are we turning to that? Why are we more open to it? Because we know, I'm talking, that's kind of Western modern,
Mhm.
you know, disassociated from the most part from nature, turned into technological cultures and digital cultures and so on. You can see it makes total sense to me why we're turning to higher powers.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I think Becker says, and certainly Gillian says, studying Becker for 30 years as he did, he says, we're all in search of power.
Mhm.
That's what life does. Yeah. You go searching and eating plants because there's power. Where's that power come from? It comes from the sun. We are power driven to continue to expand our powers. And that,
Mhm.
we call that growth and development. And then, of course, you can do that in a good way. You can do that in a bad way. You can do that in an addicted way because you don't have enough or you're constantly feeling powerless, right? So you seek, and then you want to become, superpower.
Mhm. I'm thinking about the connection with everything you're saying and kind of how Becker describes like kind of that process of looking to this higher power versus like wanting ourselves to be the hero, like you're mentioning that superpower.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. And so I think Becker is saying, and I think Terra Management is saying, is that, yeah, of course you are heroes. We are
Mhm.
all heroes because of what we are dealing with existence. I like this idea of existence, Melissa. It's really coming, and Gillian uses it a lot, and I'm going, that's a really good word.
Mhm.
We are people, right? And we belong to all kinds of identities and worldviews.
Mhm.
But if you actually think about when we get on the teeter totter together, we're two existences
Mhm.
within existence. And when you come to get that, you could say, well, that's like a cosmic being or a cosmic identity. Yeah, you could say that. But I like just this idea of existence, to
Mhm.
exist. And of course, when we can accept, right, here's the acceptance. accept the existence of the other
Mm.
with our existence, because we're both and we're all existence. It's like an undeniable fact that's just universal. There is existence, and we are existence within that existence. It's an
So
interesting thought. Yeah.
I'm wondering, it sounds like from your perspective, it's that like these different worldviews and our way that we defend them in kind of bolstering ourselves and denigrating others, that would prohibit this existence that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's what I think we're one of the ways that terror management theory and therapy, as it moves forward,
Yeah.
um, it's looking at universal. I know the positive sides, right? Like looking at universal values. I heard a talk by Sheldon recently, right? Where you give people the death prompt, but then you also give them a prompt of a universal character of care
Yeah.
or humbleness. And they find that the research is showing, just preliminary, is that you're getting interesting mediation,
Yeah.
right? If you could just even explain that to the audience, because this is a technique really of dealing with fear management.
Yeah, I think, my understanding of it is that it gets back to, so at the kind of foundation of terror management theory is the idea that our cultural worldviews provide us with this kind of sense of meaning and longevity that helps us in the face of concerns about mortality. And I think the ideas that I see coming out of this kind of more pro-social positive line of research is that we have all kinds of different values built into our culture. And so while we may have values that are, my religion is, the ultimate truth, or my political party is the correct philosophy for governing a country, we also have values built in about maybe caring for other people and treating other people with respect, and or a lot of, I think on your last podcast, you talked about living in this postmodern world. And I think that offers like a lot of people the ability to have their own philosophy and acknowledge that other people have different philosophies that are valuable. So I think that if we're able to kind of emphasize those more positive, like universal or humanistic values, the literature shows that when we remind people of death, we tend to go, I think we go with the most straightforward, available, simplest solution. It's very similar in that way to a lot of other kinds of dissonance processes. We often make those kinds of connections in our work. But I think that in the research in the laboratory, offering people this more positive, humanistic, universalist value to affirm in a lot of cases does the same that allowing them to affirm maybe the more dogmatic or kind of more rigid aspects of a worldview. It should function in the same way. And then my questions would be about longevity of that, and
Yes.
maybe, whether that's something that is natural and easy for people outside of the lab. And I often think about relationship between, it's interesting, you're talking about kind of therapy, and I'm not clinical and don't have a lot of that background, but I like to get into the coping literature a lot for thinking about, kind of the ways that we deal with anxiety generally, what you're talking about maybe more broadly. And I've been thinking that one of the things that we might be missing in this idea of acceptance might be reappraisal, that that's not necessarily the easiest strategy to use, that it might be easier to distract or to repress, but that, maybe there's something in this humanist or universalist value that is almost a reappraisal process. I don't know what you think about that. And I'm not sure I've fully developed the idea, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about recently, that there might be something that's less intuitive, but that we could use to, like you're saying, maybe in a more constructive way, manage this.
And much more conscious. It sounds, in a sense, you're making it sound, at least it sounds on the surface, it's kind of a rational reappraisal.
I think initially, I'm thinking that I guess because it might be less intuitive, that yeah, it might be more effortful, but that with practice, just like with reappraisal, you can come to where it's automatic.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
I guess that's, yeah, in my head what I've been thinking about, but I don't
Yep.
know.
Yeah. Well, let me just play off that. Thank you. I'm all for rational reappraisals and of all kinds, and I've practiced many of my own therapeutic practices just for me personally and pure processes of healing for really 4 decades. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about how reappraisal or reevaluation actually works.
Mhm.
And one of the things I've learned is that, first of all, and this is just, I'm universalizing because I've had so much broad experience for so long with many different kinds of people. People need to have some kind of cathartic emotional release first. Um, that's just a general therapeutic principle, is that
Mhm.
there's so much tied up in conflict and tensions in our brain capacities that the lower parts of the brainstem are holding most of our decision making instead of that prefrontal reevaluation parts, right? So
Mhm.
more cognitive as we sometimes use it. And they have to work together. And that's what I think a good reappraisal paradigm, which I'm all for. I would just always want to make sure. I would always want to make sure. And how are we allowing the release first? So I'm going to just give you a simple technique that is really basic and fundamental, laughable, really. And the most powerful technique I know is giving someone unconditional attention.
Mm.
In other words, the yeast for our goodness. So I'm just making this up as I go. It sounds like a poem. The yeast for our goodness is attention,
Mhm.
right? And some people say that's loving attention. Carl Rogers would say that's unconditional regard.
Mhm.
Many people in my own practices, it's unconditional attention. Of course, what is anything unconditional is another philosophical question. But it's attention with intention.
Mhm.
Attention with intention to witness another.
Mhm.
That is another word for compassion. Without trying to change them, without trying to correct them, without trying to advise them, but I witness their suffering
Mhm.
at whatever level that is. They may not even know they're suffering,
Mhm.
but you're sitting with them in the fact that they want attention, need attention, desire attention. My experience is by giving attention, the yeast, the wounds, the distress, the hurts will come up to that attention to breathe
Mhm.
because they've been repressed
Mhm.
in a deoxygenated state, using the metaphor, for too long.
Mhm.
What are they waiting for? They're waiting for the attention they never got. So this is
Mhm.
trauma theory foundation. The attention they never got when the injury went down.
Mhm. Well, and
And
it's,
that stores it.
yeah, and it's so interesting you talk about this, and it's, you're kind of speaking about it in the same way I was thinking about it, which is the trauma. And I was thinking about it in the context of the post-traumatic growth, which you're exactly right. They talk about has to happen with that emotional component, that it can't be purely cognitive. So it's interesting. I love the solution of that focused kind of undivided attention and the respect that that implies.
Oh yeah. The mutuality, we're on this game, because okay, well, they're hurting now and they need attention. Tomorrow, 2 seconds from now, I may need attention when I'm hurting. So it's like that gets us on the same. So this is what I'm always looking. What's going to get us on the same dialogical positioning, even with all the unit, all this, wonderful pluralistic, openness to possibility. If we don't, have those basic structures of getting on the social game, and if we're not, that's going to be hard to do if you're using language of, well, do you believe what I believe? Do you believe what I believe? Well, good luck. You're not going to get people playing that game very much.
Yeah.
And, so what's going to get us on playing that game? Well, I use the ideas, we have to move from coping to healing.
Mm. And what are your sense of I'm thinking this is so relevant because I talk to so many people from all different kinds of ideologies about this difficulty that we have with having any kind of discourse because people don't allow disagreement. And so I'm wondering, the term healing is very, I think, relevant and positive. And so, what is your sense about how we move then past these? I guess I call them defenses.
So
Into that
let's
place.
just throw another word in for defense, because I just, as soon as I heard you say the defenses is a wonderful intellectual word. And when I go on the other side of it, I go on the other side, the more intimate side is, and even more, I would call it more feminine side in that way sense. It's hurt.
Mm,
I'm hurt.
mhm,
Why are you defending in the first place?
mhm,
Because you're hurt. Something in your integrity as an organism has been transgressed. That, in simple language, is a hurt. And
mhm,
then I sort of saw, well, okay, so what does a hurt want? I asked that question. And this would be the next question, that if we could be teaching this to everybody. What does a hurt want? I would love to see that lesson. What does a hurt want? And we actually have to, study it in kindergarten all the way to college. And we just do a spiral curriculum of increasing complexity. What does a hurt want? That's very different to me than thinking about our defenses and what our defenses do.
mhm,
They're related. Of course, they're related. They're very importantly related. Not one's better than the other. But if we do not get to this fundamental place of what does a hurt want, and everything tells me a hurt wants to heal,
mhm,
I think that's universal. How do we heal? By getting attention.
mhm,
And so there you now have a society could be based on compassion.
mhm,
Without, right, it bypasses so much of the pluralistic differences of, we have to accept difference, we have to accept the other, and so on. I say that's great as long as you're dealing with hurt. And this is why trauma theory is arising today, because it is a superordinate universalization potential.
mhm.
Whether it'll work or not in time, we don't know. And so then another concept, we have 1 minute left before we have to go. I know you threw out, I'm interested in this fearlessness idea. So Melissa, how about we do another talk, and we'll pick up on, is fearlessness a part of this kind of solution, and how do I understand that? And again, bring in your expertise in all your areas. So if you're ready to do another talk with me at some point, let's pick up there.
That sounds great. This has been really interesting and enjoyable.
Oh, good. So I enjoyed it too. Thanks very much. So we'll just close out for today and say thanks to everybody, and get your attention when you need it.
Yeah,
Fine.
thank you, Michael.
All right. Thank you very much, Melissa.
Mhm.